Good afternoon. It is 12:01 in Atlanta, and it's time for our monthly Lunch and Learn brought to you by the Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute. And I am excited today to be joined by my co-host, Dr. Manpreet Hora. Manpreet and I have known each other for a long time and have had the opportunity to work on a number of things. And most recently, that included a discussion with a good-sized group of executives on this topic of integrated business planning. So Manpreet and I are going to share with you a lot of the learnings from that discussion and hopefully give you some action planning for today. So Manpreet, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all the attendees as well. While we cannot see you, but you're very welcome, and hopefully we'll have a good, vibrant Q&A in the end here. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah. Superb. And thank you. As always, Sean will be watching the chat and the Q&A. He may address some questions in the chat, but when we get to that point, hopefully 45 or 50 minutes in, we'll pause and Sean can help holler out any questions that we're receiving from the audience. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in and get the show on the road. So what we hope to emphasize today, this is a practice, integrated business planning, an evolution from the concept of sales and operations planning. It's been out there for decades, but it's something that's still a critical element of success for businesses large and small. It's one of those things that says easy and does hard. So we're going to talk about why it's critical now. What does it look like in practice? Lessons from the field. I think we're going to talk about the truth of where AI is in enabling IBP today. IBP is always, when you get to an implementation phase, a key element is change management. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, and hopefully we can give you some things that you can take away today. So we're going to jump right in, and I am going to pass the mic to you, Manpreet.
So folks, if you hear the term IBP, some of us may have not heard it. We may have heard it in different avatars of how it exists. Think about if you are planning and forecasting. You do your demand planning, then you move on, based on your demand planning, you move on to your supply planning. As you move on to your supply planning, you have to understand capacity, you have to understand production, you have to understand inventory, and then you have to find the money. Show me the money for meeting the demand through supply. And for a long time, we were managing this separately. But rightfully so. It's really hard to bring this end-to-end together. But we are at that stage via technology, via advancement in how companies have matured in the experience level of people. We have matured in terms of processes where we can integrate this circle that you see on your screen from demand planning, supply planning, to financial planning together. So the word integrated is bringing that us to us, and we'll talk about where this fits in strategy. It's generally looking at this operation strategy in conjunction, where you have demand planning, supply planning, and financial planning integrated together. Why does it matter? It matters because the word you see on the first sentence where we have defined IBP is a single source of truth. Generally, if you are working in any of these divisions, we have different metrics. We have different incentives. So in that case, what's lost in translation is there is no common theme that brings it together. There is no common source of truth. So that's really critical if you're thinking organizationally, thinking through an ecosystem, thinking from an end-to-end supply chain view. It also, there is enough research to tell us what you see at the bottom of the screen. It can help you improve on your metrics, inventory, margin improvements, hopefully through reduced market disruptions, which we're just going to talk about. We can also improve revenue growth. So here we will today try and answer what and why. Now, if there's Chris and I have also talked of how to do this. How do we map our metrics in demand planning, supply planning, financial planning to revenue growth, to cash to cash cycle? Hard to do it today, but please reach out to us if that how factor is interesting to you. as we mentioned in the earlier slide, IBP helps us take care of this complexity in supply chain risk. We have to be mindful of that. IBP is not static. It has to be mindful of how the headwinds are changing and how tailwinds can propel us. So for example, what you see written on the left side of the screen is the headwinds that are around us. There is a geopolitical issue. We hear about tariffs. Inflation is real. There are labor shortages. There are commodity shortages that happen. There's exchange rate fluctuation. There's several headwinds that companies go through as they're going through demand planning, financial planning, and thinking about bringing them together with supply planning. Tailwinds are there as well, and Chris has a big chunk of talking of AI. But before that, we have Industry 4.0, we have IoT. There's several headwinds companies can leverage in their supply chain to propel their integrated business planning. And by no means, Chris and I think this is going to be simple. It is a complex exercise. However, what we want to show today with our framework is if you think of it systematically, it can be simplified. It's going to be complex. It doesn't have to be complicated. So that's an important aspect that we need to bring through as we think about looking at risk. So the next slide, Chris, when we move on to that, what it's going to tell us is the different types of risks as well. You see two sort of sources of risks we brought out there for you. One is from the World Economic Forum. What the World Economic Forum does, folks, is every year they work with a risk company called Marsh and McLennan, and they try and classify risks in 4 or 5 broad categories. That's why you see different colors there on risk. They do sort of surveys, not only with CEOs, but they do surveys with normal folks like you and I, policymakers, teachers, government employees, so on and so forth, to realize where do those risks lie. And if I'm an organization that's mindful of demand planning, financial planning, and thinking about my production and my supply, I need to be mindful of these risks. I need to be mindful of how they're going to impact me. The way they break their risks, folks, is there are some threats that are clear and present danger. There are some that are going to come in 3 to 5 years, and there's some existential threats that are lingering around, and we have to be mindful. What you see on the left side is the top 5 challenges that happen specifically in supply chain. And there are no sort of surprises here, but please remember they keep changing as well. They are dynamic. I mean, till 7 years ago, pandemic would have not been in the list. 3 years ago, pandemic absolutely been in the list, right up top of there. And now you see the other ones that are coming through. Case in point is the trade disruptions that are happening. So as we go through IBP, juxtaposing what we are seeing on the screen right now, we have to manage risk via IBP as well. So while we want to enhance profits, we want to have improved margins, we want to reduce inventory, we cannot overlook risks here. So if I have to break now and dissect a world-class IBP, integrated business planning system, there are 4 critical pillars, folks. People, process are the 2 critical ones that have been existing for any type of planning. And the data and technology just propel IBP. So first is people. You need a top-down aspect here. You need executive sponsorship. We can do something. If I'm a low-level leader, I absolutely can endeavor IBP. But because you're bringing and juxtaposing demand planning, supply planning, and financial planning together, it has to come where the chief supply chain officer, the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer are in conjunction. Because it also involves cross-functional skills. You are going beyond silos to bring it together. And you're collaboratively bringing together because now you have a common source of truth. Specifically, people can come together if you don't have the processes to make it happen. Generally, we look at our processes 1 step downstream, 1 step upstream. This will require a little more than that to do that. And your planning and your roles and responsibilities have to align with that processes once you have people in place. But what really makes it happen, folks, are the 2 aspects, data and technology. For a long time when we talked of planning, data and technology were sort of merged together. We can't do that anymore. They are separate. Data works without technology, technology works without data, but together they can do wonders. And when Chris talks about AI and descriptive analytics and prescriptive analytics and diagnostics, this topic is going to become more sort of amplified why this is critical in IBP. So what this tells us is while these four pillars are important, please add one more P to this. There has to be a common purpose. Why are we using IBP? And that's sort of a cliched, but if you want to bring people, process, data, technology, and integrate it together, purpose has to be a glue to bring it together here. So largely, folks sitting down here, you may be an MBA student, you may be a consultant right now attending, or you may be somebody working in planning and saying, we already have strategic planning. Where does IBP kick in? And why are we talking about this separately? We get you. So we also wanted to sort of juxtapose this within that business framework that happens. So I know this is a sort of a busy slide, but if you take the parts in black out, that's a typical IBP sort of a business framework. You start with strategic planning, relatively long term, and then you have business planning that fits in, and then we go down and execute it more at a tactical level where we have detailed planning that's happening. IBP is there between the 0 and 2 year framework. But what it is doing, folks, is it is not looking at it in silos. It is one endeavor, it's one framework that picks up the business and says, let's bring things together. Again, starting with demand planning, supply planning, and financial planning. There are many more factors that come in. There are 4 pillars that come in, but this sort of brings out, how much flexibility we need, what plans we have, how much inventory we need, given our cost of capital, given our demand. So Chris, before you jump to this slide, you've been working with IBP for a long time. You have a huge experience in the industry. You work with a lot of small and large enterprises. If you could just summarize for us, the first function people have, what IBP is, and it may not be that. So I'll pass it to you to sort of summarize the definition of what IBP is and what it isn't.
Manpreet, thank you for that. And as you said, 20 plus years, 25 years of the wars of planning. And I think the idea, the first word is the most important word, is that integrated word. I lived in the siloed world. I think we contextually think about IBP, moving even beyond the commercial enterprise. So beyond solving for the functional challenges within an organization, effectively bringing in customer and distributor insight and effectively engaging suppliers. I mean, that to me is the aspiration, for a mature integrated business planning process. So I think that's one element. I think the other thing is the right balance between today's urgency and the downstream reality. In my view, integrated business planning is where the discipline lies to say, yes, we have to solve for meeting customer demand today, planning assets to be prepared over the next 30 days and all that out into the further horizons. But IBP should be the discipline that says, are we making the right amount of investment and focus of energy against the decisions that are going to set us up for success in the balance of this year into next year and the following? I think that to me is a level of maturity. I think that's a hallmark of a really effective integrated business planning process. I think the other thing that's fundamental for us, and again, over the course of my career, I saw more effective engagement here, is truly intimate connection with the financial side of the business. And that's from capital planning. Are we putting our capital investments to put the right capacity in place to be able to support the business? And do we have the right hand-holding and alignment across all functions to make a big bet on capital or a long-term commitment for a particular commodity or anything else like that? So that engagement with finance in the near end and the long term, I think, is obviously a hallmark of IBP as well. I think the other thing that's fundamental for me is that this is not, this is a center of the plate part of the business management process. I think I've been involved in plenty of examples where people said, well, this S&OP process is a nice hobby for y'all. Over here, we're running the business. And fundamentally for me, senior leadership understands that integrated business planning is a key element of how they're running the business today and making those aligned decisions. So I think that's what it is. I'm not going to comment too much on the what it isn't, but I do think in the what it isn't, there are a couple things I would highlight is increasingly we want data to be driving the decisions and we don't want it to be gut feel experience, that type of thing. That might be the tiebreaker, but we want the rigor of the analytics on both demand and supply and the spread between those two to be really what's driving those decision-making process. And I think the other thing, what it's not, I've come into big, management routines that are part of a IBP, and there's a 700-page deck, and I'm being facetious, but I've seen many that were more than hundreds of pages. And I said, that's a recipe for lack of success. Ironically, I've seen people walk in with a 7-page document and really get fundamental decisions made in a session like that. So we're not reading the news, we're not reporting, we're setting the right leaders up to make decisions, informed decisions. So I think that to me is the best way to think about what IBP is or isn't. So I'm going to switch gears. And I think this is our hot topic, AI, and I'll probably drop in because the reality is, for a lot of people, this has been a consuming discussion over the last year or two. For some, it's been really active engagement, and for others, it's like, what should we be doing? And I think what I wanted to kind of calibrate for us in the context of supply chain, and specifically IBP, is what's really going on in how AI is changing the game for integrated business planning today. And I think that the first theme for me, because we've had a lot of discussions around the capability of what's out there, a lot of the optimization tools that we've had in practice, in many cases for 20 or 30 years, they're really good at what they do when they're well leveraged. In many cases, though, the biggest challenge we have is making sure we've got the best inputs to go into those tools so they are the closest picture of the real world we think we're going to see, and then drawing the right insight out of those tools so we're not dependent on supreme knowledge of a tool in order to be able to give us insight. So I think that's the first thing for us, is that the LLM in today's world is an enabler of those tools. It's not a replacement. So folks who have big, huge tech stack, and frankly, even if you're not a big business working with an SAP or an Oracle or a kind of hardcore best-in-class planning tool set like Kinaxis or Blue Yonder, you're still working with tools. But to me, and what I think is validated in research and practice today, is that the LLM are enablers of those existing tools. People aren't ripping those tools out. Whether that looks the same in 5 years, we can debate that, but that's what's going on today. And I think, when we talk to people over the last 12 months, up including today, the biggest value is translating a human question into something that we can then get insight out of the tool. So we want to democratize the capability that exists in our technology platform so we can have a sales and commercial person ask a question, get an answer, and not have it go through 5 different people in order to be able to answer that. And in some cases, answer it on the spot. So we see a lot of people using that natural language interface to do that. And I think even in the last year or so, as we've seen a lot of these open source tools, I think clarifying that all those tools can be safely brought inside of your own environment to address your data security issues. So you can use a publicly available model, rent it, if you will, put it inside of your stack, and your data is not going out there in the world. So there is a practical way that people are addressing that security. So I think that's important. As I said before, the use cases are working today. We know a lot of people who are allowing current plans to be explained in plain English, leveraging the LLM. I think we are also practically seeing that this idea of what if analysis is working more effectively using an LLM. And then another piece that I have a fair amount of passion about is leveraging the LLM to get updates into your tools much faster, so that you don't have this latency and spread in terms of the underlying master data that's driving your optimization tool. You can bring that in. So I think that's the key. We're not replacing traditional supply chain optimization models today, but we're making them faster, easier, and more accessible. So I think that's the so what. And I think that's probably the call to action. If you're not seeing that, at least in a pilot basis in your organization, it's a question of where are we on this path, because this is being proved to be feasible and impactful. I do think, to put a fine point on it from an IBP perspective is the speed, okay? And we're not dependent, not just on supply chain data scientists, but having to go into the IT team to get that. And I think, latency on getting new information, but latency in answering the question. And I know a lot of the folks who are on the calls here, and I know people who've run these tools in these planning shops, and we would get these questions and we would say, you need to give us a day. We need to go back. We need to work on that. And I've worked even in the last couple of years with teams where it's a stressor on the team because the business leaders want to make the decision. And you lose the high ground if you're a practitioner, an IBP practitioner. If you say, I can answer that question, it's going to take me days. Now we've got people who say, I can answer that question. We've even got people who say, I can answer that question while we're in the room. Maybe you give me 15 minutes and I can answer that question. That's power when you can bring data insight in minutes. And I think as I talk to people a lot smarter than me who have been on the services side of this, is, scenario planning has always been one of the big defining hallmarks of IBP. We don't have to just run one plan. We can run multiple views of different sets of assumption on demand, on supply capacity, on costs, and really be able to say to people, hey, these solutions are very durable. We can move the demand a lot. We can move the cost around. This outcome holds. That's pretty compelling if we can do that. So that kind of scenario planning, moving from aspiration to reality, is what's happening to really ramp up people's effectiveness from an IBP standpoint. And I think there are documented cases now that you can go read that basically say, we have compressed time to be able to digest new insight to demand in much, much more, down inside of a day, which allows our near-in fulfillment to be able to be much more effective. I do think the structure is important, right? We're talking here, the human is in the loop. The human asks the question, the LLM goes in and queries the engine. It may query the data tables of the output of a run. It may inform a new run of the optimization, and then the insights are brought back out and translated back. So I was talking to somebody today, is that LLMs definitely can play a translation role on the input side as well as the output side. And one of the things that I've tried to make sure I educate myself is, how does this work in your tech stack? And a couple of years ago, I was talking to someone who I regard as a leader in the field, who has been in the field for 20 or 30 years, supply chain, IBP, serving clients. And the big push was, our supply chain leaders need to actually become a little bit more technical in their understanding of the technology that supports their supply chain. So I've tried hard to work on that. So as you see in the last year, how is this coming to life? And again, depending on who you are and where you are, AI can come to life, as an enterprise platform. And, not everybody can handle the sticker price, but in public, you see a big outfit like Palantir. When I first saw them 2 or 3 years ago, I'm like, who are these people? But now I know people who've engaged with them, and at scale, they can do big things and drive a lot of value. Again, that's not for everybody. I think the good news is, in option 2, everybody in their existing tech stack is working with an ERP provider like an SAP or an Oracle, or I don't know what the percentage is, 70+% of people are working with Microsoft. People are working with Salesforce, and what you find very rapidly is that these tool sets are bringing to you embedded inside of their architecture some element of AI that I think, and that may be an LLM, it may be an emerging agent network. You've got the good news, bad news, but they're already a partner with you. You're already integrated. They've already addressed the data security issue. That's coming to life. You may debate that it's not best in class, but at that point, but you've addressed a lot of the concerns of your data security folks and your IT folks with that. I do think it's also nice, and it may not be just in your ERP, but in your cloud, right? Anybody, everybody's dealing with a large cloud provider, and we're starting to see those cloud providers bring you AI capability as well, whether it's out of the box or whether it's a bit of you can build your own. I think we've even seen in the last few weeks, build your own agent inside of some of these technologies. That makes sense in the cloud space because that's where a lot of the data is, and we know these models want access to that data. So this may also, be a faster path. And then we do see lots of bolt-on, right? Lots of people we know who say, no, you don't have to get rid of any of your core systems, but you bolt us on, we're going to make your existing planning system better. We can leverage data that's inside of your TMS and your WMS, and we can help you make better decisions. That's obviously huge. It has its own issues. You may be much more targeted in terms of the capability. You may be much more fit for purpose in that, but you then have to satisfy, a little bit of the hoop jumping from your IT team and bringing in a new technology player. But we do see people moving fast with these bolt-ons as well. If they can dramatically increase the value of the solve you're getting, you don't have to worry about, pulling out a big incumbent in your tech stack. So just a helpful way to think about how does this come to life? And I think there's some analogies for this, whether you're big or whether you're small. So here's, a bit of a swag in terms of, where might we be a year from now, right? Lots of people are working on agents. I'll comment on agents in the next page. I think the kind of the co-pilot, whether it's out of the box or customized for you, for your planners, I think becomes more of the norm for sure. And it may be basic in terms of just ingesting all of the documentation of your process or your software so that your planners can say, how do we do this? It may be more sophisticated than that. This idea of a RAG, a retrieval augmented generation, another way on an internal basis to do something customized that allows you to put everything you've ever had inside of your own shop into a tool that you can also query, a little bit more of a private data set to be able to answer tailored questions for your teams. I think data hygiene tools are a big deal. I know someone who is a mid to large scale, multi-billion dollar, but just over billion business. And their first big win with LLM and AI was in data hygiene, so always on cleansing of data. And that's kind of the entry point. If you're going to use all these tools, you want to feel comfortable with the data. That's been a kind of a gateway business case that I think will be more common. And as I said before, the last one, the co-pilots can start to be more tailored. And I think that, that's where we are. I do think, this is the maturity step. I'm a big fan of human in the loop, and I think we'll make our planners and decision makers even more effective over the course of the year. And the pace of change is really fast in this space. I think that's encouraging. And as we say, people who are going to be winning, they will have addressed the comfort and concern about data. So data availability, data quality will be there. They will feel comfortable with the underlying optimization. We won't have any ambiguity around the role of the AI, and any of this hallucination will be valid in the outputs of the tools that are tapping into our optimization algorithms. And we'll feel good about how the interfaces work inside of our tech stack. A little bit about agents. Lots of people more and more every day. I think probably a year ago, most of us are just starting to hear about what an AI agent might be. There's a lot that's real there right now. If you watch any mainstream media, and the advertisements are going to hype agents, whether it's Salesforce, whether it's IBM, anybody else, but it's coming, and that thunder on the horizon is getting closer all the time. And some of you may be working with agents right now. I think kind of the hype versus the reality for us is, this autonomous idea. I think a lot of people are struggling technically. We are working at a research level with some folks as they're putting in multi-agent orchestration into existing platforms. Really smart people are still struggling to say, am I comfortable with where we are on this? And they are not going to stop, but it's not soup yet, if you will. So I think there's a lot of research, a lot of pilot, a lot of practice in here. But I think right now, a lot of the agents are much more finite. They're doing things that are very specific. They are working with people or not. We are still seeing some of that uncomfortable hallucination. So we're not there yet. It has to have human on either side of it. And so there's still a fair amount of limitations. So I think people are still generally very bullish. I can find people who are pessimistic, but I think the mainstream is well north of 50% in terms of optimism of agents playing a practical role and an increasing role. So right now, task orchestration, internal co-pilots, low risk, high volume type of stuff. So we're still far away from autopilot. I think the hype is so compelling that we've got a lot of people who are putting a lot of money into this becoming more than what it is today. And again, I think this is something where the change cycle is so rapid here. 6 months, we could be looking at something very different. I will make a closing comment, and when I talked to, again, somebody I really trusted, and they were like, this is one of the real exciting things if you're an IBP practitioner is scenario planning, right? You've got your package software. It's still the backbone. It's still got integrated data, strong governance. You've got the control and the traceability to feel confident with what's in and out. The AI layer for us that might be not just the LLM. We still don't forget machine learning is technically within the definition of AI, where we can take historical data and trends and predict based on that and train a model to do that. And optimization, maybe enhanced optimization beyond what your existing tool set has. As we said, that gets you some speed, potentially greater ability to interpret. It enhances, I think I doubled it. It doesn't replace your existing model. So I think that's important. And again, we sit on top of or beside the platform, but it's inside of an architecture that our IT people feel good and the human is still in the loop. I think that's really important. I do want to comment from an IBP standpoint. One of the things that we've said in one of our latest articles that's out there that you can find is there's a huge implication for everybody who's involved in this. And depending on where you are in your IBP maturity, there are implications for individuals and organizations is how do we collectively and how do our individuals climb this ladder? Because based on where we are, everyone needs an action plan from a development standpoint on how you build your analytics maturity. So this is not like, there are probably plenty of versions out there, but we try to create one that was really simple for us. It's based on where we are, where I am, how do I take one step up the ladder? If I'm just an Excel person, how do I get beyond that, right? If I'm working in Power BI and Tableau, where do I need to crank up beyond that, right? So I think this is just a simple tool that you could potentially use to kind of challenge yourself and your teams in terms of if we want to really start moving, from this diagnostic to predictive space, what's the gateway to that, right? And that's probably going to get you to kind of, move beyond the basics and potentially contemplate, what a machine learning model will look like. And those Python skills start to become a big differentiator. I think we make the case that, Python may be a big gateway skill set for somebody to really move up this ladder. And I do know I have it low to high, but think about it as we walk down the page. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass it back to Manpreet to talk a little bit about another key element of IBP.
Thank you, Chris. Just to bring folks, so you just heard Chris speaking about a lot with LLMs and AI. And if you just sort of think about this, when I talked about headwinds and tailwinds, when we're thinking of demand planning, financial planning, and supply planning, what he was giving out is we can be at different maturity level to leverage those tailwinds here. And we need to be mindful of that. So that's a critical aspect as we integrate LLMs into our IBP, which is absolutely bound to happen. But how far we go, as Chris said, the jury's still out. So what we wanted to do next is we deliberated what all topics we can talk about. We can talk about risk, we can talk about finance, and we can talk about something in demand planning. So we sort of settled on the latter to talk about new product introductions in the interest of time, because this could be like a week-long seminar rather than a 45-minute webinar as well. Yeah. So now if you think of new product introduction, I know this is a small, sort of a cluttered slide depending on what size of screen you have, but what we're trying to bring out here is we picked up industries, and within industries, we are trying to show that what metrics can be generally used for new product introductions, and what are the key drivers for new product introductions in those specific industries. So for example, what you see written at the bottom left is fast fashion. That's an industry that's changing a lot with shifting consumer preferences. Then there is pharma, where you have a lot of patent cliffs. So different industries will be determined by different industry imperatives, different industry product life cycles. And within those, please remember thinking of your IBP. So while IBP is in general works as a framework, you have to keep in mind your context, which is as a starting point, your industry. Now, it's very clear to us that industries are also overlapping. If you had asked me 20 years ago what an automotive industry looks like, I could have probably told you with some level of confidence. Today, if you ask me, is Tesla an electronic product or an automotive car, that's really hard. Those lines have got blurred. However, still, it's important to keep NPI, new product introductions, in line with IBP. So what you're seeing here is a slide which you probably have seen in a business school called the business canvas slide. But it's a real good reminder to us is anytime with IBP you're doing new product introduction, go back to the basics. This particular slide where you have starting in, going to purple and key partners as your stakeholders and moving on extremely right to customer segments, this needs to be populated. Even if you're doing incremental product introductions, or if you're doing, that's going to be radical for the firm as well. So from an integrated business planning, a business canvas model is a great framework to have. But the only aspect to keep in mind is how dynamic do we keep this and in what industry we are in. Is the two aspects that we think are really critical where IBP contributes to new product innovation success. It's not everything. IBP is not a sole contributor to new product introduction. We have patents, we have innovation, we have timing, but IBP has a role. Because please remember, demand planning is a critical aspect of IBP. So in conjunction, we need to bring this out. So the two things that you see written there is demand planning. Forecasting is an important aspect for new products. Second, if the product has legs, you are moving from an invention stage to a commercialization stage. The second bullet point you see there is scaling operations, where you want to ramp up. That's where demand planning kicks in, or IBP kicks in really well. Because you want to do that efficiently, you want to do it profitably, you want to do it with minimal risk. So there's two aspects where new product introductions, where IBP kicks in, is in demand planning and scaling operations. So let's talk first about demand planning through forecasting. So what you see on your screen here is there are different forecasting methods that exist for new product introductions. We picked up 3 here, which we broadly see that encapsulate different things. What you see on your left is a mix of technical and qualitative aspect called the look-alike analysis. This is where you are finding patterns in your earlier products that you've had. You're infusing in uncertainty for your future products that you may have, and then you're using sub-scenario planning, which Chris was just talking about through using LLMs to understand what is the potential adoption of the new products you're taking out. Dell, which has a modular product design, has been doing it for a long time, where they're using this particular forecasting method called look-alike analysis, where you are thinking of trends, you're thinking of time series analysis, you're thinking of different econometric methods. In the middle, what you see there is an expert opinion. And the example is Mester Grønn. This is out of Norway. This is a company which has to make vases for flowers and plants here. And which designs will work best at what price? The way they are worked out is using wisdom of crowds. They bring folks into their stores and to see how pricing can change and what people will adopt if they put them in the real-time scenario of saying this vase looks better. Because if I'm not an expert in that case, I may not even know where to adopt and what will sell more. So in certain type of industries, that expert opinion matters. Third is the example you see of Tesla. Tesla is a company which you can call it a car company, you can call it an electronics company, or you can call it a data company. With so much subscription built in the car, they have enough early demand signals that they can capture to update their cars, to update their software. However, where I want to leave you folks, if you're using IBP to contribute into your new product introduction through demand planning and seeing these examples of forecasting, please don't use them in isolation. So if you look at the next slide, Chris, this is telling us is you need to triangulate, diversify, and build consensus. Those are 3 critical elements once you've created an expectation, which we are calling normalization here. Once you have normalized your information, you need to triangulate through different methods. That's how we will bring consensus. A lot of times, forecasting has several errors built in them. And I'm sure several of you who work in the planning world, forecasting errors have different methods to capture. The forecast accuracy is a tier 1 sort of a level metric that we use. So what we are trying to bring out here is if you're thinking of new product introductions, you're thinking of demand planning, through IBP can contribute to NPI success. And within that, we're thinking of forecasting. We're sort of highlighting 4 golden rules here. Normalize, triangulate, diversify, and build consensus. Else, if you don't do these 4 products, we have a cautionary tale to tell you in the next slide. I don't know how many of you remember Segway, and I'm sure I can't see your faces, but several of you are probably smiling right now, thinking about it, where, while they had the forecast done well, where they could not use correctly is scaling of their operations and allocating resources. So they had this wonderful product, looked fantastic in the ideation stage. They just could not bring it out, and the market lost traction there. There were enough errors there. A lot of things that we were predicting, this radical product to change us, was not there. And if Chris and I have to think about it in hindsight, IBP may probably have played a part in terms of forecasting and scaling, where the contribution could have been there for Segway. And again, these slides are going to be with you. I'm not going to spend too much time going through each of these. We are already at 12:45, but this is the way how not to do it. Keep in mind, when you bring in your new product introductions, you have your forecast, you also need to have your operations. And that's the part where a lot of companies, case in point, Segway forward here. So we have a couple of few slides. I'll pass it on to Chris to sort of close us with change leadership that needs to come with IBP. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Manpreet. And the audience here, I think, has empathy for this whole change management concept. Change is critical to IBP because you're making this fundamental shift in how decisions get made in an organization. And that that in and of itself, anybody who's been involved in a transformation knows that change leadership is critical. I said before, this is a large enough change that you've got to have role modeling from leaders. And that's got to be as senior as you can. If you're in a business unit, it's got to be all the way up to the business unit leader. If you're in a bigger organization, it's got to be in the C-suite and ideally clear advocacy from the CEO. I think the other reality is many of these IBP initiatives stumble, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so without that consistent messaging, commitment, it's very easy for people to kind of give up the fight. And so for this audience, I think we're preaching to the choir. I think we understand the pitfalls that are inherent in these cross-functional silos. I only have worked for people where the silo effect was real. Maybe there are places where that's not a challenge, but most organizations, we hear the pain of the cross-functional breaking through those silos. I said before, the lack of executive sponsorship, maybe you've got the C-level, but you've got somebody on that leadership team who's not there. I kind of feel like in many cases, the supply chain leader is going to be there. I said before, you've got to have the finance lead, but you really got to have the commercial lead as well. So you really can get weakness anywhere across that C-suite. So that's something that people deal with. The organizational resistance is classic. People don't really enjoy change, or at least 90% of them. So that, why do we need to do this? It's always worked just fine. So that's there. And I think the classic one that's out there is, the lack of one version of the truth, and getting to one version of the truth is a challenge. And how do you deal with letting salespeople go sell, but also having enough capacity to be able to support over delivery? Lots of challenges there. I think for us, we think about a number of levers that may help you address those kind of things that are out there. In some cases, we do change incentives. We were involved in a project where people were incented to sell into inventory versus selling through to consumers. You had to make that change in order to move the needle. I think understanding, creating that why is important in terms of, hey, we spend $4 million a year firefighting. Let's spend that time and money in a better way, and we can do something. We can reinvest with that. In these initiatives, you always need the early wins to get credibility with people. So thinking about that in your implementation plan, I think, is critical for us. And I do think governance is important. How are decisions made, right? Who plays, who gets to say yes, who can say no? Being clear about that and making sure you enforce that's important. And then I'm a big fan of change champions. Let's find the people who have been waiting for this or see value in this. Let's enable them, give them exposure, give them visibility, and help them to influence peers. I think that's important in an individual and also can be a team or a business unit level if you're global. I do want to comment, since lots of people have stumbled, I think most of these initiatives stumble at some point in time. But I think you've got to be careful when you have got doing a restart or you've lost some momentum to address the credibility gaps that may out there and the skepticism that exists to say, why are we doing this again? I thought we could turn this off. Change fatigue is real in most organizations. So being thoughtful about that, being protective of people's time and making sure this is really value added, I think is important. In many cases, people really don't understand the process we intended to put in place. So you've got to do some reshoring so people really understand how we're trying to change how we make decisions in the business. And then whether you've had change in leadership, make sure you've got that alignment back in place. I think that's really important. So the last piece I'll cover here, and then we'll get to the close, is there are a lot of best practices that are out there. We're a big fan of structured change models. We're a big fan of making sure that you've got dedicated change leaders that are out there. We want to be open around understanding that this is a real thing that people have to go through. And we want to make sure that people see tangible value that comes out of here. So we've got to make sure we've got strong leaders at the front to allow us to kind of get through the bumps and bruises. We've got to make sure we understand all the stakeholders who are playing in here, and we've got to have intentional communication plans and making sure that we hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we act on it. Okay, we're going to close with 2 slides. As Manpreet said, you're going to get all of this. And we had that group of leaders together. We kind of said, what's the reality of what you're dealing dealing with out there. And so this is a list of challenges and potentially some actions that you could take if you see this in your organization. We see varying maturity, both in teams and organizations. There are a lot of really good open source maturity models, interview guides, that type of thing, where you can kind of see and assess that ahead of time and understand where you've got a team that could be a leader and where you have a team that needs extra support. That finance and ops misalignment, I think getting that to ground quickly is important. And we find, since the finance people have to call the ball, getting finance and ops together to run some scenario plans on the future may build some common ground and see some value that's out there. I think that goes with the second one, is some organizations just rely on the base case. We've never had the horsepower to do more than one. That's a group that you really need to think about bringing risk-based planning in, having them really see the value of scenario planning. I think that's important. So there's a variety of things that are in here that I think hopefully you can see one in there that's important to you. And hopefully you can say, there's one of these that I think we could leverage in our team. And I'm gonna bring kind of the so what to this. We do these to hopefully help you either, misery loves company, or gosh, we are struggling with that. We could use some help in that space. So I would encourage you that hopefully there's some things you can do based on what you saw today, but we're always also a resource for you. So if you've got some passion about this and say, can we talk more offline? We're happy to do that with you. But figure out where you are, and wherever you are today is a place to move forward. I mean, in my view, planning maturity, I saw it at Coke, was a 15-year journey, and they're still evolving, as I know the team that's there today. Being realistic, right? We're beyond mid-year. We're in the second half of the year. If you say my goal is to say we're going to do better annual planning as we start 2026, and I want to be a positive force in that may be your practical improvement. And if you don't see the leadership that you feel is needed in your organization, how do you drive advocacy to be able to get that message out there to make sure we've got the right leadership support to drive the next level of change that's out there? So I think that's our bottom line, is you don't need perfection to move forward. This is always a continuous improvement process. You're never going to be perfect here. So there's always one more thing to do. And hopefully we've given you some thoughts on what that might be for your organization. Okay, close, and we'll see if we've got any Q&A that's out there. We teach IBP either, in our overall sequence of courses, but we also teach it custom. I think we've taught 3 custom versions tailored this year, and we'd love to do that. As I mentioned before, we joint venture this between our overall SCL community that could include folks from our ISYE team, folks from our Scheller College, folks from our AI hub. So we're happy to bring the right horsepower to you. If you've got interest in there, we can do that on surprisingly small scale as well as large scale. Mention machine learning, and we've got our machine learning course coming up in September. That's a very popular course. If you've got to bring somebody up to that citizen data science level, that's part of our SCA series, and you can jump in over the course of those 4 courses. But the machine learning course is coming up soon. That's a virtual course. And then we've got our Gen AI class that we're going to deliver again. You can take that both virtually, or if you want to come for the weekend and spend the weekend in Savannah, come join us for that class as well. Manpreet, I do, there's a link in there, but I do, Manpreet, want you to highlight some of the excellent stuff that's relevant that Scheller's got coming up as well.
Absolutely, folks. So, I have highlighted the 3 chronologically. One's coming, there are many more this year. But the one we run sort of biannually is AI for Business. This is broad. It's just only supply chain. It just covers AI for Business, talks about policy, talks about data governance, talks of where we are, how we integrate, the risks that come along. Then we have Six Sigma with Green Belt and Black Belt. I've just highlighted the ones with Green Belt. Once you click on the QR code, you can see the ones that come up with the sort of Black Belt as well. And then we created one for board members for cybersecurity governance as well. But this is a critical point. This becomes an important supply chain risk. And for the board members who probably, are my age or older, they probably haven't gone through this themselves. So now they're at that stage, at that level in the company where they're elevated to have to make sure that's done. So we take that 30,000 level sort of view there. And we have other courses, including the one we are introducing called the Chief AI Officer and what's their role as well. So please look these out. If there are any questions, look me up. My name is Manpreet Hora. Thank you.
Sure.
Back to you, Chris.
And then I want to make sure you go ahead and register next month. We'll have Alex Rodin joining us. We're going to dig in deep as he lives in the startup world in terms of what he's seeing out there and how supply chain startups are wrestling with what's out there right now. So go ahead and join us. We just did a prep session with Alex today. We're looking forward to that one. I think we'll call it there and say thank you so much. Thank you for joining. We had a great audience today, and we look forward to having you with us again next month, same time, same date, next Thursday, first Thursday of the month. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, folks.